The ordinary day cloaked in calm suddenly split open, revealing the fragility of human confidence when September 17 came unannounced as an emergency that stripped away illusions of safety. There are moments when time, which we so easily take for granted as a river flowing gently past, suddenly rages into a flood that sweeps away all composure. We expect that Wednesdays will be like the Wednesdays before them, filled with small errands, familiar duties, and the half-forgotten rhythms of routine. But when the day that seems destined for sameness is pierced by alarm, our hearts are jolted awake with a violence that no preparation could blunt. September 17 was such a day that carried the scent of ordinary life until, in a blink, it was branded with the mark of emergency. And in that transformation it revealed to us how precarious our sense of order truly is. There is something deeply unsettling about an ordinary morning that chooses to betray us. We rise from sleep expecting the comfort of ritual, the sunlight that drifts across our rooms, the voices of neighbors, the steady clock reminding us that life keeps its appointments. And yet, beneath this familiarity, there is always the possibility that the curtain will be torn back, and what lies behind will confront us with its cold stare. When I recall September 17, it is not simply the memory of what occurred, but the haunting awareness of how swiftly a day can change from calm to catastrophe, from security to alarm. One moment we stand within the shelter of our assumptions, and the next those assumptions collapse like paper walls against a storm. Emergencies, by their very nature, have the power to strip away disguises. We are fond of clothing ourselves in confidence, pretending that we command tomorrow, pretending that the world bends to our schedules, our carefully drafted plans, our stubborn belief that we are safe. But the sudden breaking of a day into chaos tears the mask away. We discover, perhaps to our shame, perhaps to our relief, that we were never in control at all. September 17 became for me the revelation that safety itself is a fragile garment, woven thin, and that beneath it lies the raw exposure of our dependence upon something greater than ourselves. The mind resists such truths. It clings desperately to its comforts, to its explanations, to the illusion that all is well. Yet when the ground shakes underfoot, or when a cry splits the silence, or when the air itself grows heavy with foreboding, even the most stubborn heart must admit that life is not ours to tame. September 17 forced me into that admission. I had lived long enough to know, at least in thought, that calamity might arrive. But knowledge in theory is a weak lantern. It is only when the darkness actually presses in that one realizes how faintly prepared the heart was. On that day, my own soul was revealed to me, not in triumph but in trembling. The emergency shocked me, not only because of what happened, but because of what it showed me about myself. There is a peculiar cruelty in the timing of such days. Had the storm gathered gradually, had there been whispers of warning, perhaps we might have stiffened ourselves with readiness. But emergencies rarely grant us such luxuries. They descend suddenly, and their very swiftness is their sharpest weapon. One can endure much if one is given notice. But September 17 offered no notice. It seized the hour with violent hands, and in doing so it taught me that much of what I call peace is merely the absence of interruption. Real peace, the kind that can survive alarms, cannot be borrowed from circumstance. It must be rooted deeper. When I reflect upon the hours of that day, what returns most vividly is not the outward detail, the sounds, the sights, the rush of confusion, but the inward reckoning. An ordinary day shattered, and in its shards I was forced to ask, what is my life built upon? What remains when the comfort of predictability is torn away? For it is easy to move through days like a passenger lulled by the smooth motion of a train, believing that the track will carry on indefinitely. Yet the screech of sudden braking awakens us, sometimes too late, to the fragility of the journey. September 17 was that screeching halt. It was the crash of reality into complacency. Perhaps it is mercy that life does not always announce itself gently. If it did, we might never awaken. Emergencies, though they terrify us, perform a severe kindness in revealing that our security is thinner than we imagine. They are reminders that the house built on sand cannot endure the storm. And though I would not willingly invite such a day, I cannot deny that September 17 has become etched into my memory as a teacher. Its lesson was not one I sought, nor one I welcomed, but one I could not refuse. It told me that to live as though tomorrow is guaranteed is folly. It told me that the calm of routine is no armor. It told me that I must seek a foundation stronger than circumstance, deeper than expectation, more enduring than comfort. We are not as strong as we pretend. We walk through life cloaked in a false assurance, convincing ourselves that because yesterday held steady, tomorrow will as well. But emergencies laugh at such reasoning. They expose the hidden cracks in our self-made fortresses. September 17 tore at mine until I stood before the truth naked and trembling. And yet, paradoxically, in that trembling there was a strange clarity. The illusion had been shattered, but in the ruins there was the possibility of rebuilding on something true. What shocked me most was not simply the event itself, but the unveiling of how much of my peace had been built upon sand. The memory lingers with a peculiar sharpness. Not because it was pleasant, not because it was easily endured, but because it was unforgettable. Once a day has shown you the limits of your strength, you cannot return to ignorance. September 17 marked me with that knowledge. It left me with a sober awareness that life is frail, that safety is not promised, and that the emergency which shocked me was also the mirror in which my soul was reflected. And what I saw there was both humbling and instructive. I cannot claim that I emerged from it whole, for no one passes through such hours unscathed. But I can say that I emerged awake to the fragility of my confidence, awake to the reality that time does not belong to me, awake to the truth that each day is far more precarious than it seems. September 17, though it arrived like a thief, carried with it a strange gift, the gift of stripping away illusions. And though the memory still chills me, though the shock has not faded, I know that such awakenings are not to be despised. For in the tearing down of false walls, there lies the chance to build upon rock rather than sand. The true measure of a soul is found not when the world is tranquil, but when fear breaks in like an intruder, demanding that we see what foundations we have built our lives upon. It is easy enough to wear a mask of strength when the winds are gentle and the seas are calm, when each day drifts into the next with no alarm to shake us from our comfort. But the worth of a man, the very fabric of his inner being, is not revealed in those easy hours. It is uncovered when the door is flung wide without warning and terror steps inside uninvited. September 17 was such a day for me, for it entered not as a visitor but as an invader. And in that unwelcome presence I discovered truths about myself that peace had concealed. When fear enters, it does not knock politely. It bursts through the fragile barricades of our ordinary certainties. The heart, so confident in the safety of routine, is seized, and in that instant all pretenses are stripped away. We discover whether the foundations we have built upon are stone or sand, whether they can bear the weight of trembling, or whether they crumble with the first blow. On September 17, as the emergency unfurled its shadow, I felt the frailty of my foundations with a clarity I could never have summoned on my own. For in tranquility one never questions the ground beneath his feet, but when the shaking begins, he learns swiftly whether that ground will hold. There is a temptation in life to believe that peace is proof of strength. We congratulate ourselves in the calm, mistaking the absence of storms for the presence of courage. But courage is not required when there is nothing to fear. Courage is forged in the fire of alarm, in the very moment when knees tremble and hearts pound. The test of a soul is not whether it can stand tall in sunlight, but whether it can remain upright when shadows deepen, when voices of dread crowd the air, when the ordinary fabric of the world is torn open by sudden violence. That was the lesson thrust upon me without consent, and though I recoiled from it, I could not escape it. I recall vividly the sensation of being pursued, not by a visible enemy, but by an unseen dread that filled every corner of thought. It was as though the walls themselves pressed inward, as though the air conspired against calmness. In those moments, one discovers how fragile is the armor of self-assurance. Words spoken in confidence during times of ease dissolve like mist. Plans carefully drawn seem absurdly small. And even the memory of past victories offers no shield. The soul is laid bare, and it is forced to answer the question, what do you truly trust? The emergency of that day confronted me with that question again and again, and my heart staggered under its weight. Fear, for all its cruelty, is an honest teacher. It does not flatter. It does not soften its blows. It reveals the cracks in our confidence, the hollow spaces in our convictions. It demands to know what lies beneath the surface of our lives, beneath the polite words and rehearsed assurances. On September 17, when fear intruded, I could no longer hide behind appearances. I was compelled to look within and ask whether my foundations were real or merely imagined. The shock was not only in the events that unfolded, but in the unveiling of my own soul, which was weaker, more wavering than I had ever admitted. What startled me most was how quickly strength abandoned me. I had thought myself steady, prepared to endure difficulty, ready to meet hardship with composure. Yet when fear rushed upon me, that composure scattered like leaves in the wind. I learned that true strength is not a posture one assumes, but a depth one possesses. And if that depth is shallow, no amount of outward performance can disguise it when the test arrives. Emergencies strip us of pretense, and in that stripping we see ourselves as we truly are. On that day, I was forced to see. It is often said that trials refine a soul, but I think before they refine, they expose. They reveal what was hidden, whether weakness or strength, whether truth or illusion. The tranquil days are no judges of character, for they ask nothing of us. But the day of fear, the hour of trembling, presses a question upon us with no escape. And how we answer is the measure of who we are. I trembled at that measure, for I did not stand as tall as I had imagined. The emergency was merciless in this, for it showed me that my life had been resting on assumptions I scarcely knew I carried. What is a foundation, after all? It is the thing unseen, the ground beneath the structure, the silent support upon which all else rests. One rarely thinks of it until it begins to give way. So too with the soul. We build habits, routines, ambitions, and call them life. But beneath them lies the question of what truly sustains us, what truly upholds us when fear intrudes. September 17 asked me that question, and I could not delay my answer. The ordinary scaffolding of my life collapsed, and I was forced to see whether there was anything beneath worth standing on. In those hours, I came to understand why peace can be a dangerous illusion. It lulls us into believing that we are strong, when in truth we have never been tested. It convinces us that we are secure, when in fact our security is as fragile as glass. Fear shatters that glass, and though the sound is terrible, it is also revealing. For in the shards we see what was always true, but hidden that our foundations matter more than our appearances, that the unseen is more important than the seen. And while I trembled under the weight of that realization, I could not deny its truth. The measure of a soul is not in its words, but in its endurance, not in its boasts, but in its ability to withstand. September 17 was the measure for me, and I found myself lacking. Yet even in that lack, there was a strange gift, for in the exposure of weakness lies the invitation to seek strength beyond oneself. Emergencies are merciless, but they are also merciful in this. They strip away false confidences so that we might seek what is real. I did not welcome the fear that intruded, but I cannot deny that it showed me where my foundations truly lay. And so, when I recall that day, I remember not only the shock of events, but the deeper shock of revelation. Fear came like an intruder, and it stole from me the illusion of self-sufficiency. It demanded that I see myself as I was, unguarded, unprepared. And though I trembled in that sight, I know now that to be measured in such a way is a gift, however painful. For the true measure of a soul is never found in calm waters, but in the storm that breaks them. Out of shock and trembling, there emerges a summons, not to despair, but to awaken to a deeper vigilance, a more faithful watchfulness, and a courage that refuses to be silenced. It is a strange paradox that fear, which threatens to paralyze, can also become the very force that rouses the soul from its slumber. When September 17 came upon me with its sudden emergency, the first taste was bitter, for terror is never sweet in its arrival. Yet beneath that bitterness there stirred a voice, faint but insistent, that whispered that despair is not the only path. Though the shadows pressed heavily, though my heart shook, there was within the trembling a call to stand, to see, to watch with eyes no longer dulled by complacency. The shock itself was undeniable. Emergencies rarely arrive as gentle tutors. They come crashing, tearing through the fabric of the expected, leaving hearts bewildered and minds scrambling for sense. So it was for me. Yet in that wreckage there was also a clarity, as though the very shattering of my comfort peeled away the haze that had long kept me half asleep. I had been living as though days were coins without end, spending them with casual indifference, trusting in the rhythm of repetition. But when September 17 revealed how quickly the ordinary can be overturned, I could no longer afford such blindness. The summons was unmistakable: awaken, for the night is darker than you knew, and you must be watchful. It is not despair that emergencies ultimately demand of us, though despair often hovers at their edges. Rather, they demand attention, a watchfulness that cannot be feigned. To despair is to close one's eyes and surrender, but to awaken is to open them wide even when what they see is terrible. My trembling was not proof of defeat but of humanity, and in that humanity lay the possibility of courage. For courage is not the absence of fear, it is the refusal to let fear dictate the final word. On that day, as alarms filled the air, as confusion wrapped around me like smoke, I realized that within the trembling itself was an invitation. Will you collapse into despair, or will you rise into vigilance? There is a deep weariness that comes from living half asleep. It is easy to drift, to let days pass without reflection, to imagine that life requires nothing of us beyond routine. But shock is the rude awakening that shakes the soul from its lethargy. The emergency of September 17 shook me so, and in that shaking I felt the weight of the summons. It was not gentle, and I confess I resisted it. My first instinct was to hide, to cover myself with the blanket of denial, to wait until the storm had passed, and then pretend nothing had changed. But the storm left too deep a mark. Its thunder reverberated long after the skies cleared, and I knew that to return to sleep would be a betrayal. Something in me had been stirred that could not be silenced. Awakening is rarely comfortable. It is easier to dream, easier to float through days with eyes half shut, easier to drown out the alarms with the noise of distraction. But the summons that rose out of the trembling did not permit me such ease. It demanded vigilance, a watchfulness not only against outer threats, but against inner decay. For emergencies do not merely reveal dangers in the world, they reveal dangers in the heart. Complacency, pride, false security. These are as perilous as any outward storm. And so I was summoned not only to watch the world more carefully, but to watch myself. To guard against the slow erosion of conviction, to stand against the subtle pull of despair that whispers that vigilance is futile. There was also a call to courage, a courage that refused to be silenced. Fear, if allowed to speak unchecked, becomes a tyrant. It tells us to retreat, to abandon, to yield. But within me there grew a small defiance, a flame that flickered even in the wind of panic. It said, you may tremble, but you need not bow. You may fear, but you need not surrender. Courage is not the roar of one unafraid, but the quiet persistence of one who will not let fear have the last word. And though September 17 shook me deeply, it also taught me that courage is born in the same place as fear. It is the choice to answer the summons differently. It would have been easy, so very easy, to sink into despair after such a day. To say that life is too fragile, that safety is too thin, that all striving is meaningless. Such thoughts hovered at the edge of my mind, tempting me with their grim logic. But the summons would not let me rest there. It pressed me forward, reminding me that despair is not only surrender, it is blindness. It refuses to see the possibility of endurance, the possibility of growth, the possibility of rebuilding upon stronger foundations. To despair is to choose a darkness deeper than the night itself. The summons that rose from my trembling urged me instead to vigilance, to courage, to a watchfulness that refused to close its eyes even in fear. There is a peculiar nobility in answering such a call. Not because it removes fear, not because it guarantees safety, but because it refuses to be silenced. Emergencies often seek to steal our voices, to reduce us to silence, to crush the spirit beneath the weight of chaos. But to stand in trembling and yet still to speak, still to act, still to hope, that is courage of the truest kind. And so I found within myself, on that day and in the days that followed, a voice I did not know I possessed. It was quiet, yes, but it was steady. It did not shout, but it refused to yield. The summons continues still, for such awakenings do not fade easily. Once the soul has been shaken from its sleep, it cannot easily return to slumber. I walk differently now, with eyes more open, with a watchfulness that sometimes feels heavy, but also feels honest. The shock of September 17 has not left me, nor the trembling, but neither has the courage that rose from it. And though the days since have brought their share of calm, I know that calm is not the measure. The measure is whether I remain vigilant, whether I refuse despair, whether I let courage speak when fear would silence it. Out of shock and trembling there emerges a summons. It is not a summons anyone seeks, but it is one we cannot ignore. To despair is always an option, but it is the option of blindness, of surrender, of silence. To awaken, to watch, to stand with courage. That is the harder path, but it is the path that gives meaning even to the darkest day. September 17 forced me to choose that path, and though I walked it falteringly, I walked it nonetheless. And I know now that though fear may intrude, though shock may shake, though trembling may seize, there is always within that storm a voice calling us to vigilance, to watchfulness, to a courage that will not be silenced.